And there are many things we can criticize Modi for. I don't want to come across as a Modi apologist. I just want to be clear that the things we typically criticize Modi for are not the things he's done wrong. They are, in fact, places where we simply misunderstand the fault lines of Indian politics because we try to take our own fault lines and imagine them on India.
Welcome to The Focus. I'm Dr. John Bruni. India is often called the world's largest democracy. It's a rising power, a member of the Quadrilateral Dialogue, otherwise known as the Quad, a US strategic partner, and yet it's also friendly with Russia, buying oil through Russian shadow fleets, and it's a country recently field-tested in battle in a brief but tense clash with Pakistan. In today's episode, we cut through all of this with Professor Salvatore Babones, one of the boldest voices on Indian foreign policy. This is the hinge of Indo-Pacific security, unfiltered. Salvatore, welcome to The Focus.
Great to talk to you.
Salvatore, India is often touted in Washington as a key Indo-Pacific partner, but from your perspective, is America misreading the nature of this relationship?
Well, the first thing I have to point out is that everyone says India is the world's largest democracy. That's largely irrelevant. Big countries are democracies, small countries are democracies. India is the world's poorest democracy, the poorest country that has had well institutionalized governance through change of governments through elections now for 77 years. So that's really the key fact to know. And as such, it does share a similar values to the United States or to Australia or to Japan for that matter. In fact, Indians themselves often like to claim that India is not a liberal Western democracy. It's its own unique democracy. And they're flat wrong. If you go through the development of Indian democracy, its institutions, its values, its constitution, everything about it is very much what we would find is familiar in the West. It's not a Chinese-style people's democracy or a Viktor Orban Hungarian illiberal democracy. It is a classic liberal democracy, just like our liberal democracies. And so it is a very important part of maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. That said, India, you described it as a partner that may be appropriate. It's certainly not an ally. Many people use the word ally, and it's not an ally. It is a, let's say, fellow traveler. I think even partner is probably a little too much. India faces the same challenges that the West does. It faces a challenge in China. It faces a challenge from Islamist terrorism. It faces challenges from social disorganization and failed states in Southeast Asia. And those challenges are fundamentally the same challenges faced by the United States, by Australia, by Western countries seeking to keep the Indo-Pacific, safe for democracy.
There have been a lot of criticisms of Prime Minister Modi and the BJP. And there have been suggestions that Prime Minister Modi is not a traditional Democrat. Is this true in your opinion? And has the BJP government actually changed the institutions and values of India?
There has been a change in the rhetoric in India, and that change in rhetoric is one from what we might call Englistan, the old India that's an heir to colonial era institutions and ways of thinking, and frankly, publishing in English primarily and wanting to argue things out in the English language newspapers, to what you might call Hindistan, in India that's much more demotic, much more based on the Hindi language media, that is much more concerned with, frankly, Hindu religious imagery rather than quoting Western philosophers. Narendra Modi is much more likely to quote Hindu scriptures. That said, institutionally, there's nothing very different from what you would find in the West. The difference is in the electorate. The average Indian is very poor by our standards, highly traditional by our standards, and extraordinarily religious by our standards. And that poor traditional religious electorate has different preferences from what we might find from an electorate in Australia, the United States, or even in Japan. And it's funny you led with the Quad, because a lot of the same criticisms people raise against India we could raise against Japan. And a lot of them really have to do with Japan being a traditional non-Western society in a way that's not really familiar to the Anglo-American democracies of the West. But in all of these cases, the difference is not in the institutions or the processes of democracy or the safeguards of democracy. It's in the decisions and choices of the electorate.
If Modi is very much playing to a traditional Hindustani way of seeing things,
Yes.
where does Modi stand, and the BJP more generally, stand on issues like India's caste structure?
They're absolutely opposed to caste hierarchy. And that's one of the funny things, that it's difficult for us, again, as Westerners, to go into understand Indian politics. Narendra Modi is definitely on the ultra conservative side of Indian politics. He's on the Hindu side of Indian politics. And we've been taught that, oh, conservative Hindus would embrace caste hierarchy. Uh, Quite the contrary, actually. Hindu reformers have been working to undermine caste hierarchy for more than 100 years now. And in fact, in India, the often repeated phrase, this is not my formulation, this is the standard formulation of Indian political pundits, is that Narendra Modi has substituted religion for caste, and that he sought to unify people across Hindu faith instead of dividing them on the basis of caste. Now, the main opposition parties, by contrast, not the Congress Party. The Congress Party is not a caste-based party, but most of the other opposition parties in India are, in fact, caste-based parties. That is, they're parties of a particular caste who promote their own caste interests. So whatever else, and there are many things we can criticize Modi for. I don't want to come across as a Modi apologist. I just want to be clear that the things we typically criticize Modi for are not the things he's done wrong. They are, in fact, places where we simply misunderstand the fault lines of Indian politics because we try to take our own fault lines and imagine them on India.
Salvatore, in India, there is a slow burning insurgency with a group called the Naxalites. And for
Yeah.
our audience, they would be considered neo Maoists or some sort of communist confabulation. Now, they've been around for quite some time. You say that the opposition groups, apart from Congress, would be drawn from caste.
Many of them, not all of
Many,
them.
not,
No.
not all of them, but would the Naxalites be one of them that are?
Naxalites are, for the most part, a proscribed group, so they don't participate in Indian politics. And that's one of the ways that India has been downgraded on international democracy rankings, is by prohibiting terrorist-linked parties from participating in the political process. Now, there are two thoughts on that. The thought in Northern Ireland long was, reconciliation is fostered by having the political arm of the terrorist group invited into politics. In India, by contrast, and in here, it's the same as in Germany. Terrorist links groups are excluded from politics. So the Naxalites are not welcome in Indian politics. It's hard to see where they stand. That said, they're not a caste-oriented group. They actually are much more a religion-oriented group. We usually would think of Maoism and evangelical Christianity as being opposing forces. And in fact, the Maoists initially started saying that they were absolute atheists, towing the communist line, until they realized they got no support among tribals in the northeast of India. So then they adopted Christianity. And so now they're Christian Maoists, whatever that means. But their barrier to them participating in politics has been their historical, and until very recently, continuing involvement in terrorism. Now, there's been a peace agreement just this year. Naxalites have come in from the cold, and it's expected that they'll join politics now that the active insurgency seems to be over. But where they fit in India's caste hierarchy, the Northeast is a bit unique. It's tribal. Ethnically, it's much more similar to Myanmar than to the rest of India, and it's not particularly Hindu. So caste doesn't really enter the equation in the main Naxalite areas.
Salvatore Modi is, by all accounts, extremely popular among Hindus, but how is he viewed by India's Muslim population?
He is not very popular among Muslims, and he's widely vilified by Muslim civil society groups and Muslim religious leaders. Not all of them. So, for example, he has been embraced by Sufi Muslims in India, largely because Sufi Muslims are often persecuted by the majority Sunni Muslims in India. So there are these internal divisions within Islam as well as within Hindu faith. That said, he certainly does very little to reach out to Muslim voters. The narrative coming from the BJP is we're all Indian and there are no differentiations. It's very much a, French ideal of a, like in France, of a secular society, but it's a secularism being enforced specifically on Muslims. So just like French secularism is not really enforced very much against Catholics in France. It's always the cry against Muslims in France. In the same way, Modi and the BJP have embraced secularism, but everybody knows they've embraced secularism as a bit of a cudgel to hit Muslim religious leaders with. That said, it's difficult to say what's good or bad. The Congress Party, the main opposition party in India, has embraced Islamism or separate Islamic personal laws in the interest of reaching out to a Muslim voter base. Now, most of us in Australia would regard it as monstrous that, if a Hindu woman wants a divorce, she goes to a civil court, but if a Muslim woman wants a divorce, her husband can simply divorce her in front of an imam with no further procedures, that she can be disinherited because she's a woman, that she has no control of her children because in the Muslim law, the children are the wards of the father, not of the mother. Now, those are things that we would find unacceptable. Narendra Modi has pushed what's called a uniform civil code, the idea that everybody, Muslims included, should be bound by a secular civil code. But let's not make him too much of a liberal hero. His reason for doing that is to vilify Muslim institutions and to attract Hindu voters. So these are very complex issues. It's difficult to say who's in the right or the wrong. I've written on this myself that, can we support a good law being proposed for bad reasons? The reasons are clearly bad. I mean, the reasons that the BJP wants a uniform civil code is clearly to other Muslims. But it's good law, right? We should all want a uniform civil code in our democratic countries. And many other BJP initiatives have that same smell of they pass the literal test, but they're not as, they don't come from as liberal a motivation as we in the West might like.
Salvatore, as a democracy, what can you say about India's opposition as it's currently structured? I mean, the Congress Party had been the dominant political force in India up until the rise of the BJP and Narendra Modi. So, what does the opposition actually stand for? What are its policy planks, and what is its vision for India? I mean, if one were to be in India as a voting person, what would you be voting for against the BJP?
Well, that's the Congress's chief problem, is that it doesn't seem to stand for anything. It used to stand for a light state socialism of state ownership of industry, but that's gone. It was actually a Congress prime minister, Manmohan Singh, who was as finance minister, most responsible for dismantling what they call the license Raj of people only being able to engage in business if they have a government license. Later, as prime minister, Manmohan Singh privatized state industries. So that old Congress brand of a, indigenous socialism, that has mostly disappeared. Not entirely. There's still a lot of Congress stalwarts who want the Congress to be more of a socialist party, but it simply hasn't behaved that way. It's become more of a New Labor sort of party. That said, it hasn't replaced that with anything. The Gandhi family mainly trades on its fame. Of course, Rahul Gandhi, the current opposition leader, is the son of Sonia and Rajiv Gandhi, who Rajiv Gandhi is a former prime minister. Sonia Gandhi has been the force behind the throne for the last 30 years in the Congress party. And before that, his grandmother was Indira Gandhi, and his great-grandfather was Jawaharlal Nehru, the independence leader. No relation to Mahatma Gandhi. The Gandhi family,
Right.
Nehru's daughter Indira married a Gandhi unrelated to Mahatma Gandhi, Feroz Gandhi. So it's a family dynasty that commands loyalty as a family dynasty and runs the party. Now, that's fairly typical in the developing world, and particularly in South Asia, where if you look at Sri Lankan politics, at Pakistani politics, at Bangladeshi politics, you'll see the same family names recycled all the time, because political parties in most of South Asia have been, for the most part, family parties. The BJP is a great exception to that. The BJP has a very coherent ideology. It's an ideology that some wildly embrace, others flee from, but it's a very clear ideology of uniting India around a Hindu civilizational core. They no longer say that in their official pronouncements. They're a fully secular party, but everybody knows it's the Saffron Party, or the Hindu party in India. They certainly trade on that identity, and they have a series of core issues that they have been pursuing consistently for 30 or 40 years. One India nationalism, so Kashmir is part of India. They abrogated Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, which had created separate institutions for Kashmir and Jammu and Kashmir. Now Jammu and Kashmir are governed as a part of the unitary Indian state. They had long insisted they wanted a temple in Ayodhya, the birthplace, as they see it, of Lord Ram, the Indian god Rama. There had been a mosque on that site for the last 400 years. The mosque was torn down by BJP-linked activists, not by the BJP, I should hasten to add. But that was done in the 1990s, and we now have seen the rebuilt temple at Ayodhya. And their third big issue has been the Uniform Civil Code, fundamentally done with the attitude: if Hindus have to have a civil code, everybody, Muslims, should have to be under the civil code. And those three key issues have been its key issues when it wasn't in power, and now that it's been in power, it's delivered on them.
Okay. Well, interestingly enough, when we talk about these kind of political dynamics, here in the West, we're always trying to split people up and identify people by various categories, and it doesn't matter what part of the political spectrum you're from, that's what we do. The Indians seem to be pushing in a different direction, and the BJP in particular, by what you're saying. They're trying to find ways, connivances, if you will, to bring people together in spite of their differences. That will be an interesting experiment to see play out in the near future. Anyway, look, if we can turn then to strategy for the moment. When we were talking earlier, we were discussing the difference between India and the United States in terms of strategy. They're not an American partner, but Americans like alliances. India doesn't do
No.
alliances. So, how do we reconcile that? Is the US ready to work with a partner it can't fully control?
It's been very difficult for the American security establishment to understand India. And that goes very deep. There are very few India experts in the United States who are not themselves of Indian origin. And of course, you can be of Indian origin and be an expert on India, but inevitably, subjective points of view creep in. It's very difficult to find what you see for China. Regarding China, you can find a panoply of American, Australian, foreign sinologists who are not people of Chinese origin, who have devoted their lives to studying China. There just isn't really that cadre of India experts in the United States. And as a result, there's a real misunderstanding, or a very poor understanding, of India. The fact that India won't be an ally is something that Americans find very troubling, because they simply don't understand the Indian context and what things mean in India. Indian history is one that is very, it's obviously long and extensive, and goes back into the mists of time, and it's very well known by Indians, who are an extraordinarily patriotic, nationalistic population. And let's just face it, I'm American. Americans are all about today, right? And not about thousands of years of historical baggage. And so Americans have a lot of trouble understanding this baggage that comes from Indians wanting to pursue their own independent way in the world.
Salvatore, Indians are a growing immigrant community in the United States. Is this not a resource that the US State Department can tap in some way to sort of fill that gap that you just said that
It
exists?
is a resource, but and again, it sounds very racist to say it, but it's simply a fact that people are subjective, and inevitably, people from India will tell you about their India. And it would be just like saying that, well, just like one time American foreign policy towards the Soviet Union was entirely informed by Russian emigres. And those Russian emigres, well, they knew a lot about Russia. If you ask them about Tolstoy, they could give you a dissertation on Tolstoy. But were they really entirely unbiased and objective when they thought about the Soviet Union? Probably not. Now, it's not as extreme with Indian Americans or Indian Australians, but the problem is still there that Indians in Australia and the United States are not people who've studied India. They're people who are from India. And that comes with all the baggage, all of the subjective impressions, all of the, you know, all of their personal viewpoints, as opposed to a pure objective scientific, cold hard scientific perspective, which I have to emphasize comes from American sinology. There's incredible American expertise, and for that matter, incredible Australian expertise on China. But note that it comes from non-Chinese Australians who've learned about China as an external object of study. All of the major China study centers in Australia are actually run by Australians, not by Chinese, not by people of Chinese extraction, not by Australians of Chinese extraction, but by Australians of European and other extraction. Now, is that necessary? It's hard to say, but the promised dividend of having lots of highly successful Indian Americans and Indian Australians simply hasn't paid off in understanding at the highest level, because I think inevitably they're playing Indian politics at the same time that they're giving advice. Whereas, again, America's sinologists are not playing Chinese politics when they give advice on China.
Is it also a case, Salvatore, of just too much information? I mean, the threat of the day is, of course, China. So everyone's national security apparatus, foreign policy apparatus is geared toward understanding China, just as we did do once with the Soviet Union
Yeah.
and what we did during the war on terror with Arabs. There were schools of thought that were
Yeah.
developed to objectively look at these particular threat vectors, if you will. But India, well, it's not a threat, it's not a friend. It's all probably a bit too hard and a bit too much and a bit too complex.
Look, I think the effort just hasn't been made. I rarely, not rarely, never see a potential PhD student who wants to do a thesis related to India who's not of Indian extraction. And that's a problem. It's not just me, it's all across the field. Now, there are plenty of non Indians who study Sanskrit because they're fascinated by ancient Sanskrit texts, and not a problem. There are plenty who study medieval India. But when you talk about studies, contemporary political and international relations and sociological studies of contemporary India, the entire cadre of expertise is of Indian origin, and it's very thin. It is not a major priority. There aren't the India Studies centers. I mean, Australia doesn't have an India Studies center. Australia has a Australia India Institute in Melbourne, but it's entirely dedicated to promoting things like business connections and athletic cultural connections. It's not a research center. There's not a single research center in Australia. There are very few in the United States. There's a very prominent one at University of Pennsylvania. There's one, I believe, I'm sorry, it's either at Stanford or Berkeley. I'm not sure which one in the Bay Area, but they're very few compared again to the number of China studies centers. And this is not just something new. This is something that goes back historically a long way. The US and the Western world have been engaged with China for more than 100 or 150 years. India was the British backyard. And so India attracted a lot of cultural study, especially in the United Kingdom. There's enormous expertise on Indian religions, on Indian languages, and a lot of that is British expertise, but not on contemporary India. It just hasn't been a focus of people's studies.
It's interesting. When I was a lecturer at the University of Adelaide, we were doing Asian studies, and of course, India does come up from time to time. And the thing is that this was often a lament that not enough effort has been put in to Australia's relationship with India, because the only thing that we really know about India is that they like to play cricket,
Yeah.
and perhaps they also like to drink beer, and that's really about it. And curry, and don't forget curry. They
Yeah.
make a mean curry. So our knowledge of India is very facile to a great degree, and it still remains that, considering what you've just said, in many places.
Look, I hear lots of colonial era generalizations or Nehru era generalizations about India all the time. There's very little knowledge of even the most basic facts about modern India. I mean, even simple statistical facts are poorly understood. People love the stories, but they don't run the numbers. And again, sorry to keep bringing up China, but that contrasts heavily with China, which is a very numbers oriented, statistics oriented field. Yes, they're the sinologists who focus on what's happening in Beijing, but there's also a lot of economic study of China. There's also a lot of sociological study of China. And again, we just don't see that in India. You can't name an Australian economist who's an expert on the Indian economy. It
No,
it just
no, you
doesn't
can't.
exist. And there are very few in the US. And what very few there are in the US, as far as I know, are all of Indian origin. Again, not to beat that drum relentlessly, but um, it does have that aspect of navel gazing about it.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Well, look, let's now turn to sort of international relations, but at the leadership level. If we look at the leadership chemistry of, you know, the obvious ones, Modi on the one side and Trump on the other,
Yeah.
was there ever genuine strategic alignment there, or was it all just about good optics?
So they seem to get along very well, and I have no doubt about that it's a genuinely warm relationship. They both like spectacle. When Anthony Albanese visited India and they took him around in the it's like a Pope mobile, except it's a cricket mobile. They went around the Narendra Modi Stadium. I kid you not, with a crowd of 120,000 waving. And he seemed very uncomfortable. And this is a new experience for him, right? He's never. This is not something Australian leaders do. For Donald Trump, that was very natural. It was great. Let's go around the stadium and wave to the adoring fans. So I think they get along very well. That said, mostly what the US seems to want from India is that it would buy American fighter jets. That the F-35 be sold to India. There's a strong emphasis on defense procurement. And American defense firms, the big defense contractors, being upset that India has bought French equipment, that India has bought Russian equipment, that it hasn't bought a lot of U.S. equipment, and certainly not the big ticket items. It's bought lots of like small arms from the U.S. and other artillery, and now there's some helicopters from the U.S. But India hasn't been spending the big money on U.S. defense procurement, and India has the largest defense procurement budget. I'm sorry, defense import budget in the world. So it's a big potential customer. That seems to drive the relationship. In fact, the US think tanks that have a focus on India, those think tanks seem to overwhelmingly receive money from defense contractors. Now, I don't know that for certain. I can only see that in the character of the reports they produce. Uh, but that seems to be the basis for the relationship that the United States wants. Thus, the United States has been very upset that India has continued to rely on some Russian equipment, or for that matter, that India buys French jet fighters and submarines.
But yeah, but there is a subtext here which we haven't raised, and that, of course, is India's entire rationale strategically is to maintain strategic autonomy. And so, therefore, I would imagine that it would not be in any Indian prime minister's best interest to be too reliant on an external supplier, one external supplier in particular. So, for
Yeah,
instance, when you buy the JSF, the F-35 Lightning, you're not just buying an aircraft that you can fiddle around with. You're buying an entire
yeah,
supply chain from the United States, which will then put a number of limits upon how India
yeah,
will use those fighter planes.
exactly.
Now, if you're a guy that's in the Indian Department of Defense, and you kind of think to yourself, well, we want to maintain our strategic autonomy. What is America doing for us if we buy into this supply chain? Will they
Right,
let us do what the Israelis do with their JSFs? I don't think so. So there
right.
would be doubts about the veracity of going down that particular
Yeah.
path, I would imagine. So, as inviting as it sounds for India to buy American products like JSF, I just don't see it happen.
Look, there is a lingering Indian suspicion of the United States that's shared by all political parties in India. There is no rah rah America political party in India. That said, there are also no anti-American political parties in India that have any chance. I mean, the Communist Party is anti-American, but they have no chance of taking power. So it's not an anti-American country, but it's a country that adores America, that idolizes America, but that doesn't want to be beholden to America. And I think many people in India, fear that they will end up living in an American world or be at the mercy of the United States. So yes, the strategic autonomy, the words you used are the words that are commonly used for this, but it's reflected in practical terms in the fact that India strongly prefers cash and carry sort of defense procurement. So again, countries like Russia, France, and Israel, I think those are the big three suppliers to India, who will sell them the equipment and let India take it and do what it wants, no strings attached. What they have bought from the U.S. are largely, you know, uh, objects that infantry assault rifles, things like that, that really aren't subject to potential U.S. restrictions.
Also, there is the little problem with Russia. India has very close ties to Russia, and
Yeah.
we'll dig down a little bit into that just after we pass this point. But I mean, I imagine that there would be, because the Americans are very nervous about losing their IP to a country like Russia by selling to a friendly third country like India. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden, the next generation of Russian warplanes come out, and oh my God, they look very similar to the JSF.
Yeah.
Where did they get that idea from? So, is there, I mean, obviously, Lockheed Martin and the US government would be very concerned with regard to the Indians managing to lock down that sort of American technology because, it is an
Yeah.
important piece of kit for the United States, and probably will be for at least the next 25 years, right?
Well, but they're still pushing hard to sell it. I'm not sure how concerned they are. What they've been strongly pressuring Indians to do is to give up the Russian S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems, and that I think is a bit. I mean, I understand the rationale. The rationale is that S-400 data could be fed back to Russia and help Russia detect or understand how to detect F-35s if F-35s enter the Indian arsenal or any other American aircraft. However, I've actually argued and argued in print that it is beneficial for the United States to have India maintaining these Russian supply chains. And that may sound very strange, but the fact is that India is buying them for use against China. And if India doesn't buy them, China will. So China has the previous generation Russian anti-aircraft missiles and its own Chinese clones of those missiles, the S-300 missiles. India has made a condition of buying S-400s that they not be sold to China or Pakistan. And so as long as India is buying them, Russia has one customer in the region, and that customer is not China. The minute India stops buying them, Russia will need to make money where it can make money. And so the idea of using India, using a low level of India-Russia collaboration to prevent an even higher level of China-Russia collaboration, while it may be unpalatable and leave a bad taste in the mouth, the fact is it's better for the West and better for the world if Russia remains an independent country as opposed to becoming some kind of Chinese vassal state. And really, the one country that's doing more than any other to prevent Russia from completely sinking into Chinese hands um, is India. So, you know, for good or for bad, I mean, there are people who fantasize about a complete Russian collapse and Putin being ejected from office if he didn't get the oil money or the defense purchases from India. I think it's more likely that Russia would simply turn even more to China if it didn't get if it didn't get any support from India. And let's be clear, India is not providing some enormous buoy to the Russian economy. India is not rich enough for that. It's a lifeline, and keeping that lifeline open, again, however unpalatable it may be to people like me, at least, who strongly condemn Russia's behavior in its invading Ukraine and its behavior is bullying vis-a-vis its neighbors. Just from an absolutely, again, cold, hard, rational perspective, maybe it's better to let India keep Russia afloat.
That is interesting. Okay, well, I mean, I just want to use this little anecdote here, and that is, We've gone through a similar sort of situation with JSF and S-400 before, but with Turkey, and
Yes.
Turkey is a NATO member,
Yeah.
and that's completely complicated that relationship between Ankara and Washington D.C. I suppose similar things now are said about let's keep Turkey sweet, let them play around with some Russian kit, maybe we learn something from them, so on and so forth. But ultimately, there must be always that anxiety that something important will slip through to the other side, in spite of how controlled you think things are. So, anyway,
Well, but there's
interesting.
one huge difference I'd like to remind everyone about, and that is that Turkey, although it has elections, is a harshly authoritarian state. India is routinely accused of being an electoral autocracy, but I mean, I think I show very conclusively in my book, and I'll take the opportunity to plug the book,
Please
Dharma
go ahead.
Democracy, that when we go to the numbers, India is a liberal democracy that has real elections where the opposition, where it basically shares our values, and Turkey, for all it does have elections, and the most recent elections in Turkey were competitive. I not sure I would trust Turkey in the same way. I wouldn't trust Turkey's monetary institutions, the press in Turkey, the opposition parties in Turkey, the judiciary in Turkey, the same way I trust those institutions in India. That the press, the judiciary, the opposition are keeping the government honest in a way that may not be true of Turkey. So, yes, there are parallels between the two situations, but there are also fundamental differences of values.
India is currently buying oil using the so called shadow fleet, allowing
Yeah,
Russia to skirt Western sanctions. Is this trade in oil indirectly funding Putin's war in Ukraine?
it certainly is. The Indian response to that is Europeans spend far much more on Russian natural gas than India spends on Russian oil. Yet those European countries have a carve out from the same kind of attention because they supposedly can't go anywhere else. India is a very poor country. GDP per capita is roughly on a par with that of the continent of Africa, and getting cheap Russian oil is a big boon because they buy that oil at a serious discount from global oil prices. Now, whether they should or should not join Western sanctions uh, is a matter for Indians to debate and decide. But I'll tell you from the Indian side, the way they see it is entirely put up or shut up to Europeans. That if Europeans don't care enough about Ukraine to cut off their imports from Russia, why should India, which has no quarrel with Russia, and that's something we really have to remember is there's no animosity or ill will between India and Russia, and there's no particular alliance between India and Ukraine. So if even Europeans who are closely aligned with Ukraine, who've taken millions of Ukrainian refugees, who are deeply involved in the Ukraine war, if even they're buying Russian hydrocarbons, Russian energy, again, Indians, I'm not making the argument, I'm merely reporting how Indians of all political parties see it. Um, why should they be the ones to cut off themselves from Russian oil?
So, Salvatore, how does Washington tolerate this arrangement? I mean, they've basically planted their flag on the hill in terms of where they see Russia and Ukraine, but they're also pressuring other countries not to trade with
Yeah.
Russia. Is the US making quiet exceptions for India because of its strategic significance? You think?
The U.S. is making exceptions for India because it wants to sell defense equipment to India. I mean,
It's a very
there's
blunt statement.
yes, I mean, there's a strong. Um, so if we go back to the Biden administration, during the Biden administration, there was the Republican Party in the U.S., which is generally closer to defense contractors, was entirely happy for Narendra Modi to visit Washington to give a speech to the joint session of Congress to meet at the White House, and they were all rah rah India. Uh, the Democratic Party split. The more human rights focused half of the Democratic Party were very anti-India and anti-Modi, and they boycotted some events, whereas the defense contractor funded half of the Democratic Party welcomed Narendra Modi. The positive side for Modi, no one ever said, and I found this shocking, no one ever said, we support India because they're a fellow democracy with a strong human rights record. What they said was, Well, despite what we hear about India's human rights record, it's an important partner, by which they mean an important customer. And it's just that simple in US politics. There are very powerful groups in America who want to sell things, primarily defense equipment, um, to India. And so they advocate for India. I, as a social scientist, just find that shocking because I've gone through the data on India's human rights record, and it's very solid. I mean, there's just nothing to the anti-India human rights claims, but they've been repeated and repeated and washed so many times that they've simply entered everybody's consciousness.
A thought just occurred to me, and that is if America manages to sell the JSF to India, will that then put constraints upon its tolerance with regard to India's relations with Russia? Do you think there's a quid pro quo here? Yeah, look, India, you can buy my JSF, and that's all very good and fine. Oh, but by the way, now that you're in the American supply chain, that sort of thing that you're doing with Russia and the shadow fleets, I'm not so pleased with that. Can we do something to ameliorate your pro Russian leaning? Do you think that buying the JSF could also be a trap for India where it then has to toe an American line, or
Yeah.
else spare parts maintenance for the
Yeah.
JSF disappears. It just
Look,
disappears.
look, I don't think it's going to happen, and for precisely those reasons, that the pressure can be exerted once India joins the program. That said, the F-35 is increasingly yesterday's fighter. New concepts are being developed. With by the time India were to buy it, it would probably no longer be the frontline American fighter. Both the F-22 and the F-35 are likely to be replaced sometime in the 2030s. And if the F-35 ever entered India's service, it would be in the 2030s. I mean, there's no chance of it happening in the 2020s. So maybe it won't be that important by then. Maybe Russia won't even be an enemy by then. I mean, we just don't. We're looking pretty far out into the future. Just remember that the F-35 is emblematic, but the defense procurement relationship between the US and India goes much deeper than that. And there's a whole list of things that American contractors would like to sell to India. The big one right now that's being discussed is howitzers. And howitzers are not something that most of us have ever heard of, never mind think about. But of course, the Indian Army is procuring howitzers, and they have a contract, right? And these contracts, the U.S. is as the world's largest defense exporter. The U.S. is not all about just one plane, right? It's about a whole panoply of companies and equipment that want to sell into the. Again, I want to emphasize the world's largest defense importer. I mean, India is the country that um, buys the most. They're usually neck and neck with Saudi Arabia for being the world's
Mm.
biggest defense importers.
Yeah, but unlike Saudi Arabia, India still is considering itself a strategically autonomous player in the international community. And so both of those things tend to be rubbing up against each other. Whether or not you'll have a smoother entrance of India and a much more mature situation between New Delhi on the one side and Washington on the other. That's for time to tell. But at the moment, it just doesn't seem like a really good fit right now.
Probably not. And look, the fact is, India is a poor country, and
Yeah,
the
that's right.
Rafale, the French fighter that they buy, is probably more than good
Affordable,
enough. Probably
right?
beats anything that the Chinese can put in the air in numbers. I know the Chinese have some extraordinary technology where they have one or two examples, but they haven't industrialized these technologies. And if India can fly a Rafale fighter and have the S-400 systems and can continue to and buy Israeli technology because they put Israeli technology in the nose cones of those Rafales, they can probably keep ahead of China and Pakistan, and that's all they really need to do. Remember, India is not seeking air dominance halfway around the world. They're not going to. The United States can bomb Iran from 12,000 miles away. India is not going to bomb Paraguay, right? It really has very limited uh, defense interests. That is preventing a Pakistani or a Chinese invasion, launching these short-range retribution strikes if Pakistan has any terrorist activity in India, as happened last month, and maintaining security on its border with Myanmar and Bangladesh. These are, for the most part, not anywhere as demanding as what the U.S. and NATO seek to do.
You're listening to the Focus Podcast. I'm your host, John Bruni. If you're finding these deeper global conversations useful, please support us by subscribing on your favorite platform and sharing this episode. You can also catch up on previous episodes at sageinternational.com.au by clicking on the Media Center drop-down menu and clicking either video or podcasts. Now back to the conversation with Professor Salvatore Babones. Salvatore, you did make mention about China and Pakistan, and of course they had that recent clash in early May of this year. The Rafale did not turn out to be the weapon the Indians were looking for, apparently, because the Pakistanis fielded China's J-10Cs, not their top line models, and yet it seemed to have outperformed the Rafales. Do you think that this may have changed the balance of power in favor of China and Pakistan, at least temporarily?
So first, I should emphasize that I'm not a military aviation expert. All I know is what I read about these, and I've heard conflicting accounts. And modern air warfare is much more about action, over the horizon action at a distance, than about dogfights or anything like that. So what happened and what missile technology side had, honestly, I really have no broader expertise on that. What I can say is it's clear that India met its strategic objectives with relatively minor losses on its side. It struck deep within Pakistan at either terrorist camps or facilities that were used to support terrorism. The US and most Western observers seem to broadly agree that these were terrorism related facilities, not just quote unquote innocent Pakistani army facilities. And it struck them with very little losses of its own on its own side. Now, the fact that a country loses one or two or however many aircraft in a war, the goal is to meet their strategic objectives. And India seems to be, certainly Indians are very happy and feel that they have met their strategic objectives. Beyond that, I can't really second guess how many fighters they may have lost and whether it was worth the loss, whether they were put in danger. I mean, I'll just change the subject a little. I know there's been a lot of debate all over the military blogosphere about the future of the tank and how many tanks have been destroyed in Ukraine. And people forget, well, the whole purpose of a tank is to go into danger where human beings can't go. And in a way, the whole purpose of the aircraft is to reach out into dangerous spaces. So has the Rafale been successful? I have no idea. Was India successful in its strikes? Yeah, clearly so.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with you on that. I'd also say that we in the West tend to fetishize defense products because they look good, they make us feel good when we look at them, and somehow we tend to believe everything that the arms suppliers tell us that these things can do. Not a conspiracy theorist or anything, but let me tell you, a good sales pitch, well, the Americans can put one on, that's for sure. And so can the Europeans when it comes to arms and who's better at what. But the thing is that weapons are meant to be destroyed. And so long as
Sure.
overall strategic and tactical objectives are met, the losses don't really or ought not to matter. But they do today because everything costs so much. I mean, what is it? The entire package for one JSF, and let's see if I can get my brain wrapped around it, somewhere in the vicinity of over $100 million an aircraft. That's a lot of money. And for a poor country like India, that's a lot of money. The Rafales may come in at a significant lower cost. So losing these aircraft in combat, it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt a bit.
Well, also, look, it's clear India does not have the same dominance over Pakistan and China that the United States and Israel have over Iran. But no one would expect India to have that kind of dominance. It's increasingly a peer-to-peer relationship. And remember, the Chinese economy, and Pakistan, for those who don't know, Pakistan is effectively a cat's paw for China in these regards. For those who aren't doing the math, China is still about 4 times as rich as India. So if India is simply able to hold its own, that in itself is enough. That is, India seems to have no appetite for foreign military adventurism, for offensive action. It has since independence, it's only struck back when attacked. It's never initiated attacks without provocation, and there are no signs that it ever would initiate attacks without provocation. So again, like, what's enough defense for India. India does not need the capability to do deep, long-range stealth attacks in pursuit of global geopolitical objectives. All it really needs is to defend itself, and India seems to be doing a reasonably good job.
But there is the argument, Salvatore, that if India was going to become, in the American mindset, a bulwark in the Indo-Pacific against China, they'll have to be a bit more ambitious to support American strategic objectives. They can't just sit on their haunches and say, "Yeah, that's enough
Well,
technology for us. We don't need any more than that because our ambitions are very light." If they're wanting to put their,
yeah,
best foot forward with the Americans, and the Americans will expect them
yeah.
to
No,
play a
you're
much
absolutely right. But the key is in what you just said: American strategic objectives. and
yeah.
those aren't and those aren't Indian strategic objectives. And India, uh, I mean, I'm sorry to break anyone's hearts back home in the U.S., but India is never going to pursue American strategic objectives. India is not going to be, let's say, in Australia, where it was shocking that the Labour government here in Australia did not send a frigate to join U.S. patrols in the Arabian Sea and the Red Sea. It was shocking because Australia has always viewed its defense as being centrally connected to keeping the U.S. on side, and the deal is that Australia serves American strategic objectives, and by being a loyal companion in doing so, it receives the benefits of sitting under the American umbrella. And that may not be an attractive thing to many people, but that's been the fact of Australian history since World War II. India is never going to be like that. India has its own goals, and those broadly align with American goals. That is, containing China, preventing escalating Chinese influence in Southeast Asia and South Asia, preventing any further expansionism from Pakistan. Well, as long as America is willing to deputize India on those goals, the relationship will go well. If the United States wants more, if it wants India to join any global crusade, it's simply going to be disappointed in that, and that's simply a non-starter in Indian politics for any political party. I mean, it would be political suicide for any party in India to say that it wanted to join the coalition of the willing, whether it's in Ukraine or in Iraq or against Iran. It simply won't happen. It would be profoundly unpopular.
Well, while we talk about all of this, Salvatore, you mentioned that Pakistan is kind of acting as China's cat's paw, but Pakistan is also a nuclear power in its own right.
Yeah.
And its governance is not particularly stable, which would mean that both Beijing and New Delhi would be looking very carefully at what was going on within the borders
Yeah.
of Pakistan. Um, because of this tension between Pakistan and India, realistically speaking, how much of its strategic attention can be played elsewhere? I mean, how much of India's defense forces, their defense forces are large by any standard, but how much of that will be geared toward taking care of its most immediate threat in Pakistan, and how much of that will be, siphoned off into the mountains where they share a very small border with China, in order to placate the Americans and their strategic aims and objectives.
Look, India's defense posture has been since independence and will remain for the foreseeable future entirely defensive. Will India defend every inch of what it perceives to be, and I say perceived to be because these are disputed borders, will it defend every inch of what it perceives to be its territory against China? Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. Will it join a U.S. effort to contain China in the South China Sea? Never. It's not going to happen. Not a patrol boat, not a search and rescue aircraft is going to go to the South China Sea to help defend Taiwan or to contain China in the South China Sea. It is purely concerned with its own defense. And I repeat this: no appetite whatsoever for territorial expansion or any kind of overseas adventurism. India had one expertise with overseas adventurism in Sri Lanka, and that was its role as peacekeepers in the Sri Lankan Civil War. They quickly found out that peacekeepers became targets, and that was the end for India's, and the prime minister at the time, Rajiv Gandhi, was assassinated by Sri Lankan or by Tamil freedom fighters connected to Sri Lanka. They weren't actually Sri Lankan, but supported from Sri Lanka, and that was it. Like, that's as far as India's ever gone overseas, and even then, they were invited in by the Sri Lankan government to serve as peacekeepers for a truce that had been negotiated. Uh, Indian troops don't go any further than that, right? And so it's simply not in the cards. It just doesn't matter to talk about it because it's never going to happen, at least not in this century.
Okay, so if that's the case, though, Salvatore, China must know this pretty
Yeah.
well. I mean, they're pretty confident that India can't be a bulwark of Chinese containment because India is focused on maintaining India. It's
Well,
not.
yes, no, they're containing China in Nepal. There's strong Chinese influence in Nepal. They're containing China in Bhutan. They're containing China in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, at least until recently, the recent change in government in Bangladesh. And they're subtly involved. No one knows exactly how much in Myanmar. That is, there's a strong Indian diplomatic and defense presence in Myanmar. There are no troops in Myanmar, but I mean diplomatic military attaches, and being involved now again, trying to counter Chinese influence in Myanmar. And, India's defense interests correspond almost exactly to the former borders of British India. Uh, those areas that were carved out of British India or had treaties with British India for their, that the British were in charge of foreign policy of these territories like Nepal and Bhutan, India's interested in. Go beyond that, virtually nothing.
Okay, well, that leads me to the next question, and that is India is part of the quadrilateral dialogue, otherwise known as the Quad, alongside the US, Japan, and Australia. But it's the only member not aligned with sanctions on Russia or hard
Yeah.
containment on China. Can the Quad really function with India having one foot out the door?
The big weak link in the Quad right now is, to be frank, probably Australia. Under, under Joe Biden, it was the United States. Joe Biden's administration had really no interest in the Quad. It demoted the Quad from being a defense-oriented grouping to being one centered on, I think the issues were climate change, coronavirus, and South Pacific Islands. I think were the three things. And when they had a Quad leaders summit and issued their priorities, uh, India is generally supportive of the Quad. It's generally comfortable, I think, with Japan and I would say India is probably more comfortable with Japan as a partner than with the United States or Australia. Uh, the Quad's popular in India, but no, it's not that important in India. It's just one more organization that India is a member of. And to contrast the Quad, remember, India is also a member of China and Russia's axis of evil. It's almost hard to call it anything else. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And India became a member along with Pakistan. China wanted Pakistan as a member, so Russia insisted that India become a member, not because India wanted to be a member, but because Russia didn't want China controlling the whole organization, and so Russia brought in India. Similarly with the BRICS, the BRICS is a China-dominated organization, and India is a member. But in all of these organizations, India seeks to limit Chinese hegemony. That is, India is in these organizations precisely because the other members view it as a counterweight to China. And in the Quad, India performs almost the same sort of role in that as long as India is in the Quad, well, India will do defense cooperation. I mean, India's gone farther with the Quad than with the SCO or the BRICS in that when there was a supportive U.S. administration under the first Trump administration, there were Quad naval exercises in the Bay of Bengal, and India, will participate in the Quad in a defense guise, not only in a civil guise. That said, certainly the Quad with India as a member is never going to become an alliance, and that's very clear. Does Quad still have a purpose without India as an ally? I suspect yes, but it's a limited purpose, and it will hold back the organization. Well, it will hold back the grouping from ever becoming an organization as such.
I'm just thinking out loud here, but the US and Australian policymakers who had these great dreams at some point that the Quad is going to turn into, some grand military alliance of sorts. They're going to have their moment of disappointment if they're not already going through it right now. But when we talk about the Quad and we look at the relationship which you've just raised between Japan and India, it is true to say that Japan and India have become thick and fast friends.
Yeah.
However, I would argue that the high point has been past. I think the high point was when Shinzo Abe was Prime Minister of
Yeah.
Japan, and he was linking up with India in a very rapid way, and the Indians were welcoming him with open arms. But now that Japan is going through its own sort of internal
Yeah.
political turmoil, do you see that relationship is starting to weaken?
It really is based much more on civil cooperation and development cooperation than anything else. India is building high-speed rail using Japanese technology as opposed to Chinese technology, of course, but it's also not using French or Spanish technology. It's Japan's Shinkansen technology being exported to India. Most of India's metro systems are either using or looking at Japanese technology. So there's been a lot of development assistance going. It's just one way from Japan to India. People in India, Japan's popular in India, but very little talked about. It's completely non-controversial. I doubt there will ever be any kind of very close alignment between Japan and India. For India, Japan's simply an alternative, not only an alternative to China, but an alternative to the United States. It's it's a place where India can get technology, cooperation, know-how, without having to deal with with the inherent challenges of dealing with American politics. And not just Japan, France performs that role as well. So although India does not have a close relationship with the European Union as such, it has a very close and long-standing relationship with France. Here, more based on defense technology, but also civil nuclear technology and other French technologies.
Okay, Salvatore, final question. If India's not a sidekick and it won't be an ally, what should the US relationship with India actually look like in the 2030s?
India is a fellow democracy, and really the world of the 2030s, 2040s is going to be an axis between the great democracy of the developed world, which is the United States, and the great democracy of the developing world, which is India. As India's economy expands, and I really do believe that India's growth is baked in, at least for the next 10 years. That is, this 6 to 7% growth is just a rebound. It's very much like China grew very rapidly between 1980 and 2010 because it was just rebounding from 100 years of repression of the economy. India is going through the same process of removing the lid on economic activity, and the growth just happens. India's growth, like I said, is pretty much baked in until India catches up with the middle income countries of the world. By that point, by the mid 2030s, by 2040, India's economy will be as large as China's economy. And at that point, instead of being, the poor country of Asia, well, right now we think of China as a potential global hegemon with that kind of economic development. India is going to be a seriously attractive model for countries in Africa and throughout the poor regions of Asia, as people wanting to do things the Indian way, which will come with much fewer geopolitical strings attached than doing things the Chinese way. So I really think what we're looking at, I mean, everyone's always pessimistic. It's always, oh, it's the end of the world. The Chinese are taking over. The Russians are taking over. Our economies are collapsing. All this angst. When in fact, what I see is a very positive future. I see a future where the U.S. and the broader U.S. Atlantic nexus is very prosperous, while at the same time in the developing world, India is becoming an additional pole of prosperity and a model for the developing countries of the world. That, when you add those together, the West and India as two separate poles of support for democracy, freedom, human rights, human flourishing, human dignity, I think that tells a positive story for our future. And I'm very much looking forward to living through it.
Salvatore, thank you for sharing your insights on the focus.
Thank you.
As the US faces a new Indo-Pacific reality, India stands at the crossroads of strategy, values, and power. Whether it's buying F-35s, reshaping Quad dynamics, or pushing back against China while maintaining ties to Moscow, India isn't playing by the old rules, and that might be exactly why it matters. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Salvatore Babones. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Salvatore and connect with him on social media. Now, on to questions for the audience. Should the US treat India as an equal partner, even if it refuses to align fully with American strategic goals? How should the US respond if the India-Pakistan arms race escalates due to China's influence? Can the US continue calling India the world's largest democracy despite Modi's controversial domestic record? Let us know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producer of The Focus, Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. And don't forget Blue Sky on The Focus pod adl.bsky.social. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.